UN climate change negotiations have begun in Lima, and they are hoping to build on momentum created by the recent US-China bilateral agreement announced at G20. Now, last night we discussed the financing of any agreement, and tonight we're focusing on the aims when it comes to cutting emissions. Asad Rehman is senior campaigner for Friends of the Earth UK and leads the organisation's campaign for international action to prevent climate change. Good to talk to you tonight. Let's start with that deal struck between China and the US. Are you encouraged by it?
Well, I think we've got to look at it at two different levels. If we're considering it purely in terms of its political impact, then we have to say that a political impact has been made by the fact that the United States and China have made an announcement. But if the test is it in line with what is required by the climate science to prevent a warming that will devastate billions of people's lives in terms of, and also threaten our planet, then it's not. I mean, what actually the United States have said is that it was pledging to make emission reductions which are even smaller than what they pledged 2 years ago in Cancun, and definitely nowhere in line with what's actually required for us to keep below the 2-degree target, or let alone the 1.5-degree target. So there is political significance, but actually the planet doesn't really judge you on political significance. It judges you on concrete action. And unfortunately, on concrete action, there's a lot to still play for.
Now, while that might still be lacking, though, in terms of these negotiations that are sort of beginning over the next week or so, how critical is it to have seen at least some political will to get other countries on board?
Well, it's important, of course, that there is political will, but an agreement purely on political will could be signed, but if that agreement is weak and full of loopholes and doesn't deliver the kind of action that's required, then it's not really worth the paper it's written on. What's really required is for us to be able to make sure that any agreement is robust, it's comprehensive, it includes all the different elements that are needed to make sure that we keep temperatures well below 2 degrees. I mean, your viewers and listeners in Australia, I think, have experienced firsthand the devastating impacts that we're seeing from these adverse weather changes all around the world. The heat, the droughts, the floods, and these are likely to get much, much worse. That's what the climate scientists are telling us. They're telling us that we've got this 1 decade to make the kind of emissions reductions that are needed, and then really bring ourselves back down and to grow cleanly, to transform our energy systems to a much cleaner, greener energy system. That's better for people, the planet, and actually will save us much more money and better for our health. So we need to be able to make that kind of transition, and that really requires political backbone from political leaders, and political backbone requires them to be able to say they're going to do more than just to make short-term announcements that look good, but actually aren't worth really the paper that they're written on.
And to your point about alternative energy, I mean, how much ground is being given by some of the old energy companies, the ones who've sort of held on to power, and how much are they investing in those alternative energy sources?
Unfortunately, not enough. And if you listen to some of the big oil companies, they are saying, well, there is no political will for a global climate treaty that will shift the world away from dirty energy. So it's important that we continue to invest in dirty energy. In fact, they're spending billions on finding new sources of dirty energy. Where the climate science is telling us of just existing known resources, we have to keep about 80% of that in the ground if we wanted to prevent catastrophic climate change. So unfortunately, the oil companies, the big dirty energy companies, the coal companies, they're looking at their profit sheet, and they're looking at short-term profit. What they actually need to be looking at is long-term viability for their countries, their people, the planet, and that means that there needs to be a massive transformation. There is the technology, it is technically possible, it is scientifically possible for us to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But what's required is political will. And political will means we need to invest heavily now in the new sources of energy. And the new sources of energy are abundant, they're clean, they're better for us. So governments need to look to new they need to be investing in the new green businesses that are going to bring us jobs, rather than looking behind and looking at old dirty energy businesses.
And I'd presume there'd be money to be made in new industries as well, which is always the puzzle as to why they're not invested in. But how critical is it to get an agreement in writing, or is it more about real decision-making going forward?
Well, it's always critical to get a binding treaty because a binding treaty ensures that everybody is taking action when we're dealing with a common problem. So we're dealing with a problem that is global in nature and requires everybody to do their fair share of effort. To do that, what's required is for you to know that your neighbour is doing what's required, and they to know that what you're doing is what's required. And for you to know that actually what they're saying is a genuine commitment, that it's not hot air, that they're not pretending to make those emissions. This is really, really important. So that's why we need a robust agreement. We need an agreement that is top-down and science-based. So that means that you just can't have this Wild West kind of system where everybody says, here's what I will do, and because that's what I think I can do. You actually need to say, here's what the science tells us we must do. How do we share that effort fairly? How do we make sure that we cut in emissions, but also recognise that some of the poorest countries, those that haven't caused this problem, need our help to be able to grow cleanly, but also deal with the impacts of climate change. Because what's around the corner is going to be quite devastating for billions of people. We're going to see real impacts on our food production. We're going to see real impacts in terms of the impacts of climate change. Less than a year ago, we saw the devastating impact of Typhoon Haiyan on the Philippines. Thousands of people killed in that typhoon. Those kind of adverse weather impacts are going to happen much more regularly and be much more devastating for many people around the world.
Asad Rehman, we wish you well in your negotiations and talks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev.